Hello and welcome to the podcast for Ray Church of the Nazarene. I'm Ben Beckman, Senior Pastor, and I'm glad that you have tuned in to listen to our services and sermons. We have reopened our sanctuary and would love to have you join us in person at 410 Blake Street in Ray, Colorado for our Sunday morning worship services that begin at 10:45, if you feel comfortable to do so. We would also invite you to join us live on Facebook, YouTube, or our website if that's a better fit for you at this time. Please visit our website at raynaz.com and our Facebook page for more information regarding our services. It is my prayer that you experience the presence of God during your time with us, whether in person or online. Again, thank you and welcome to our podcast. This week's message is week 3 of our 4-week sermon series entitled New Mercies. This week we focus on procrastination and how that affects our lives in so many ways. We look at the life of Saul, where we read about him in 1 Samuel chapter 9 and 1 Samuel chapter 17. I pray that you are blessed this week. We are in week 3 of our sermon series entitled New Mercies. And the purpose and point over the last several weeks is that we are exploring sometimes the difficulties of what it means to change and experience change in our lives. The first week we talked about time and understanding time and the purpose of things that happen in our lives and kind of wrestling with that question of how to respond when we're faced with times of and changes that happen or even forced upon us. So we talked about that in week 1. Last week, we talked about sanctification and this process that God works changes and these changes that happen in our lives, and our response to that needs to be of a full, wholehearted submission to God. This week, I'm excited about talking about what we're going to be learning today, but I've been putting it off. Today we're talking about procrastination. And I've entitled today's message, Now's the Time, but maybe tomorrow. And we all, I think, in many ways wrestle with procrastination and the effect that it happens in our lives. And for some of us, procrastination is a bigger issue than for others. My daughter, Grace, does not procrastinate. It is amazing. She has a project that's given to her, and it drives her crazy if it's out there lingering. Me, on the other hand, I see that there's this project, and I'm like, there's plenty of time, all crammed into the last minute. And so I've recognized in my own life that at times it's very unhealthy, and at times it's caused me a whole lot of grief. I ran across this quote that I want to share with you this morning. Procrastination is my sin. It brings me nothing but sorrow. I know that I should stop it. In fact, I will tomorrow. So this morning, as we're talking about this, I want to get you to kind of start thinking about your own life and the things that you see and know that you're having to deal with. What is it that you procrastinate about? Sometimes it's a chore that you have to do around the house. I don't know if it's the same in your house, but laundry is one of those things. And not so much the cleaning of it, but the folding of it and putting it away. And it's not directed at you, sweetheart. It's me. Because there's a stack of clothes right there at the end of the bed that seems to stay there at the end of the bed. And it's not that hard to go put it away, but yet I find ways to put it off. Sometimes, for some of you, maybe it's some other type of big project. Maybe it's homework, a project at work, all kinds of things that we tend to find ways to put off. Phone calls maybe to a friend or family member that you know is going to be hard or difficult or awkward. And I know that we're all in good company, that we all procrastinate in some way, in some time, right? We all can come to that agreement. Please say yes. I know I'm not the okay. But like I said, some of us procrastinate all the time. Procrastination is derived from a Latin verb called, or pronounced, procrastinare, which means to put off until tomorrow. But it's more than just voluntarily delaying. Procrastination is also derived from the ancient Greek word akrasia, which means doing something against our better judgment. So when we put those two things together, put off till tomorrow against our better judgment. Think about that for a minute. We all know that we have this gift and this opportunity of time, and yet, against our better judgment, we put it off. Charlotte Lieberman is a psychologist and an author, and she wrote several different articles, and she wrote a couple things that I want to share with you here this morning. She says, procrastination isn't a unique character flaw or a mysterious curse on your ability to manage time, but it's a way of coping with challenging emotions and negative moods induced by certain tasks. And I stopped and thought about that. And I got to thinking about the things that I tend to put off in my own life. These negative moods, these changing emotions, because of these tasks that I have. She goes on to say, boredom, anxiety, insecurity, frustration, resentment, self-doubt. All of those things play into why or how we procrastinate. The particular nature of our aversion depends on the given task or situation. It may be due to something inherently unpleasant about the task itself, having to clean a dirty bathroom or organizing a long, boring spreadsheet for your boss. But it might also result from deeper feelings related to the task. Listen to this. Such as self-doubt, low self-esteem, anxiety, or insecurity. I thought that was interesting. I hadn't thought quite so much about why I tend to do some of those things or not do those things that I know I need to do. And as I was thinking about those, is this a result of my ability, my thought of being able to do this project well or not? And for some of us, not being able to do something well, we tend to kind of put that off. If I can't do it perfect, then I'm not even going to try it. Is it because of a low self-esteem, a low view of ourselves? I am in over my head. I can't possibly do this. I don't have the skills, the abilities to take care of that. Does it come from anxiety or insecurity? And I think that can be significant too. The way that we perceive what we are about to do, what kind of stress is it bringing into our lives? Will I be able to accomplish this in time? All of those things play into sometimes why we don't do what we know we're supposed to do. So as I was thinking about that, I began asking myself this question: how does procrastination affect our relationship with God? And as I was thinking about that and praying about that, I got to thinking about Saul. Saul was this first king of Israel. And Saul was somebody that was unique in the time that God had called him to do something great for himself. And I want to kind of draw your attention to a couple of passages of Scripture, all of them found in 1 Samuel. And beginning in 1 Samuel chapter 9, and then jumping over to 1 Samuel chapter 17. And we are not going to read this entire section of Scripture. There's a lot that happens in chapter 9. There's a lot that happens in chapter 17. And I want you to go back and read it. And you guys many of you are probably familiar with these passages. Chapter 9 deals with how Saul was chosen and the process that Samuel was a part of in calling Saul to be king. And so I want to draw us there. I want to draw us to chapter 17, which many of you are familiar, is where David begins to come onto the scene. And in fact, David will soon be appointed king. And it's this process in chapter 17 where David faces the giant, Goliath. And so we're going to jump around a little bit today. And so I hope you can kind of keep track. But the first thing that I thought of as we're asking this question this morning is, how does procrastination affect our relationship with God? I want to move you to 1 Samuel chapter 17 first. In verses 4 through 11, I want to read this passage to you. A champion named Goliath, beginning in verse 4, chapter 17, beginning in verse 4. A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. He was over 9 feet tall. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armor or of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. On his legs he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield bearer went ahead of him. In other words, what's being recorded for us here is that he was a big dude, and he was carrying a lot of stuff that weighed a lot, and so he was big and he was intimidating, right? Verse 8, Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." Then the Philistines said, "This day I defy the ranks of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other." On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. So we get this picture of what's taking place. Basically, Goliath is out there and he's smack-talking the army of Israel. He's calling them out. And he's saying all kinds of rude, mean, nasty things to them to rile them up. And yet, with all of what he's saying, nothing takes place. In fact, if you jump over to verse 16, it says, "For 40 days the Philistine came forward every morning and evening and took his stand." This happened for 40 days. And so here in verse 4, we get this picture of who Goliath is, his stature, his size, and big, intimidating guy. I want to draw you back to chapter 9. I kind of warned you, we're jumping back and forth here a little bit, but I want you to see how Saul is described. Chapter 9, verse 1, "There was a Benjamite, a man of standing, whose name was Kish, son of Abiel, the son of Zeror, the son of Bechorath, the son of Aphiah of Benjamin. He had a son named Saul." Listen, "an impressive young man, without equal among the Israelites, a head taller than any of the others." That's kind of interesting how Saul was described. Saul was described as not some puny little nobody that God overlooked, but God saw him and described him in this way. And yet here he is in chapter 17 facing this giant. And what does it say right there at the end of that passage on verse 11? "On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified." So Saul, the tallest of the Israelites, as we read in chapter 9, he was especially worried because he was obviously the best match for Goliath here, right? He stood head and shoulders above them. In God's eyes, however, Goliath was no different than anyone else. And we begin to see that unfold as David takes the scene here a little later on. We also understand here, as you read through chapter 9, that Saul was appointed king. He was God's chosen to lead and the one to trust God in this situation. But his inaction his inaction was disobedience. Because he didn't respond, because he was trying to put off what was happening and taking place, his disobedience, it's sin. So how do we think about that in our own lives? How do we think about the situations, the circumstances we find ourselves in? How do we see ourselves in those things? Do we take this attitude of kind of waiting and seeing how this is going to play out? Now, I think that there's a balance in all this, obviously. We talked about that in our very first week on this series when we asked you this question as we looked at Ecclesiastes chapter 3, what time is it? And obviously we need to understand that. We need to understand what God's doing in that moment. And I don't think that as these armies were lined up to face each other for 40 days, that inaction was what God was looking for. And so here we find Saul for 40 days inactive. So disobedience is the first thing that we can see here, how procrastination affects our relationship with God. The next thing I noticed as I looked at Saul's life in these couple chapters is that there's this misplaced trust, this misunderstood identity, and this confusion of purpose. I want to draw you back again to 1 Samuel chapter 9. You're going to keep your thumbs in both places as we go back and forth. But stay with me here. So we read verses 1 and 2 that Saul came from this family, that this group of standing, that Saul was an impressive young man that stood head and shoulders above the others. And then as this story unfolds, as Saul interacts with Samuel, as Samuel is telling him that he is God's anointed one, you read that here in the latter part of let's start in verse 17. When Samuel caught sight of Saul, the Lord said to him, "This is the man I spoke to you about. He will govern my people." Saul approached Samuel in the gateway and asked, "Would you please tell me where the seer's house is?" He's looking for Samuel. He doesn't even know really who Samuel is at this point. And he's seeking Samuel because his father, they lost some donkeys. And so Saul is out with a servant trying to find these. And so they sought out Samuel in hopes that Samuel would tell them where these donkeys are. Verse 18, Saul approached Samuel in the gateway and asked, "Would you please tell me where the seer's house is?" "I am the seer," Samuel replied. "Go up ahead of me into the high place, for today you are to eat with me. In the morning I will let you go, and I will tell you all that is in your heart. As for the donkeys you lost 3 days ago, do not worry about them. They have been found. And to whom is all the desire of Israel turned, if not to you and all your father's family?" Saul answered, "But am I not a Benjamite from the smallest tribe of Israel? And is not my clan the least of all the clans of the tribe of Benjamin? Why do you say such a thing to me?" Now I read past that passage, kind of not really understanding until I remembered verses 1 and 2. In fact, you read verses 1 and 2 and you kind of read through it kind of quick. I tend to do that when I encounter genealogies in Scripture. So-and-so begat so-and-so, son of so-and-so, and I'm like, okay, I can't pronounce half of those names, so I'm just kind of moving on. But Saul misunderstood, again, who he was. And he misunderstood why that mattered. In verse 21, he says, "Why do you say such a thing to me?" Saul's outburst here reveals a problem that he faces repeatedly throughout the rest of Scripture here. He struggles with this feeling of inferiority, this idea that he is not who he is supposed to be. And Saul oftentimes, as we read through Scripture, he falls back and forth between his feelings and his convictions. And this tug of war of going back and forth causes him sometimes to to be ineffective. It causes him to not act. And so, as we look at this passage again, Saul said that his clan was the least in the smallest tribe in Israel, but says his father was a man of standing. So the tribe of Benjamin, it was the smallest because they were nearly wiped out as punishment for their immorality. And you can look that up in Judges chapters 19 through 21. But Saul didn't want to face, ultimately, the responsibility that God had given to him. As you read later in 1 Samuel in chapter 15, we see that Saul kept some of the war plunder back. And he tried to blame his soldiers for doing this, while claiming that they had already taken it to sacrifice God. That's all found in chapter 15. So Saul didn't want to face this responsibility God given to him. He was always trying to find excuses for not doing what he was supposed to be doing. And although Saul had been called by God and had a mission in life, he struggled constantly with feelings of jealousy, with feelings of insecurity, of arrogance, of impulsiveness, of deceit. And he did not decide to be wholeheartedly, completely, fully committed to God. And this came through in the way that he didn't act. So because Saul would not lead and would not let God's love rest in his heart, he never became who God desired him to be. And in fact, later on, we read that God was sorry that he had anointed Saul. So this misplaced trust, a confused identity, a misunderstood purpose can also affect us in our relationship with God. It plays into our procrastination sometimes. The third thing that I noticed about Saul and his life was the way that he was not a good steward of his time. And this stewardship and urgency of time also plays into a change of perspective. I want to draw you to 1 Samuel chapter 17 again. Verse 16, as we read, "For 40 days the Philistine came forward every morning and evening and took his stand." And then I want to draw you to verses 32 through 50. It's a little bit of a longer passage, but it's important for us to read it as we understand the context of what's going on. So for 40 days and 40 nights, this Philistine Goliath came forward, taunting the tribe or the nation of Israel. Beginning in verse 32, as David comes to Saul, saying that he is willing to face the giant. Saul replied, "You are not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You are only a boy, and he has been a fighting man from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant has been keeping the father's sheep. When a lion or bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defiled the armies of the living God. The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." Then Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. David fastened on his sword over the tunic and tried walking around because he was not used to them. "I cannot go in these," he said to Saul, "because I'm not used to them." So he took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, and put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with his sling in his hand approached the Philistine. Meanwhile, the Philistine, with his shield bearer in front of him, kept coming closer to David. He looked David over and saw that he was only a boy, ruddy and handsome, and he despised him. He said to David, "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. "Come here," he said, "and I'll give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." David said to the Philistine, You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, with whom you have defied. This day the Lord will hand you over to me, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. Today I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds of the air and the beasts of the earth, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands. As the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly towards the battle line to meet him. He ran toward him. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, without a sword in his hand, and struck down the Philistine and killed him. We see a little bit different perspective here between Saul's inaction and David's action. We see here that there was a sense of urgency, a sense of purpose, a different perspective that David had that Saul didn't. And we have to take a different view of our time today as well. We have to view it with urgency. We have to view it as an investment. We all get the same amount of time every day, right? You've all heard the saying, we all get the same 24 hours. But what does our life show with those same 24 hours? What do we do with those 24 hours? David had a different perspective of the situation that he found himself in. He had a right perspective of God and understood what time it was. And what a difference perspective can make. Most of the onlookers only saw a giant. David, however, he saw a mortal man defying his God. Goliath was a target too big to miss. That was his perspective. Different perspective. He knew he would not be alone when he faced the giant. David knew that God would fight with him. He looked at his situation from God's point of view. And we can all ask these questions as we look at David's story here and ask ourselves some of the same things. The giants in our own lives. Who or what are those giants that you're facing today? When we view these impossible situations, these difficult circumstances, but we look at them from God's point of view, how does that change what we're faced with? How does that change our response? Does it motivate you the way it did David? Once we can see clearly, we can fight more effectively. We can respond more appropriately. We can be effective in who we are and who we are called to be. We all face a certain amount of criticism around us as well, right? And David wasn't alone in that. David faced the criticism of the fellow soldiers as we read in chapter 17. He also faced the criticism of Saul himself, and yet he responded appropriately. And I know in my own life, when I'm facing things, projects, situations, whatever it is, I don't know as I always look at it with the same perspective, the same urgency that David did. I don't always allow that criticism to roll off my back. Sometimes I let that stop me. I let that hold me back. Procrastination is a hard thing. Because as I learned in preparing this, it's not just being a poor manager of my time, but there's these underlying things that affect and are oftentimes the reason why I'm being held back or I hold myself back. And it's because these things take root in my life. That disobedience, being ineffective, not responding when I'm supposed to respond. This misplaced trust and identity of who I am and who God is. Misunderstood purpose of who I am. And then also, my poor understanding of perspective and time. Those things affect how I respond to what I'm facing today. And we can easily look at the world around us and see that how some of these things play out. And I think sometimes the church has played into that. The church has been silent on things that we need to be vocal about. The church has been ineffective in things that we do need to be effective about. And so to further wrestle with that question I presented to you in the first week, what time is it? I think we're starting to see in different ways what time it's beginning to be. And our first response always, always, always needs to be through prayer. The very next step I take has to begin with prayer. And then trying to understand what God is doing and join Him in it. There's a fable which tells of 3 apprentice devils who were coming to this earth to finish their apprenticeship. They were talking to Satan, the chief of the devils, about their plans to tempt and ruin men. The first said, "I will tell them that there is no God." Satan said, "That will not delude many, for they know that there is a God." The second said, "I will tell men that there is no hell." Satan answered, "You will deceive no one that way. Men know even now that there is a hell for sin." The third thought for a minute and said, "I will tell men that there is no hurry." "Go," said Satan, "and you will ruin men by the thousands." As we think about that, the sense of urgency that we need to have today to respond, to not put off till tomorrow what needs to be done today has to stop. As we continue to wrestle with this question, what time is it? The motivation behind that needs to be the sense of urgency to present ourselves to God in prayer and be willing to be obedient in what He's asking us to do. The most dangerous of all delusions is that there is plenty of time. I want to invite the praise team to come on up today, and we're going to sing and we're going to worship, but I also, as we begin to do that, I want to pray for you as we continue to wrestle with this. What does my response today need to be? What does yours need to be? How is God calling you to act? What's standing in the way of that? And can we be willing together to acknowledge that there's things in our life that we procrastinate, that we push off, because it is hard and it's difficult. Frankly, I don't want to do it. As I was thinking about that, I was reminded of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus, as He's praying before He's getting ready to be handed over, and He's praying with earnest, drops of blood, pleading and asking God that this cup would be taken from Him. And I'm not saying that Jesus was procrastinating, but He certainly was wrestling with what was before Him. And in prayer, willingly submitted Himself. Not my will, but yours be done. So can we look at the life of Jesus and in the way that He struggled in these things that He did not want to do, willingly do it, because it's the will of the Father for us. We don't have to fight alone, as we saw with David.
David knew that God was with him. We can face these giants today